Thank you so much. My name is Nathan Tumuhamye from the Resilient Africa Network. I will be presenting our success stories regarding how we've been able to engage the citizens for policy changes, especially focusing on climate change. And we've been doing this actually in different settings, especially in one we did some deliberative polls in East Africa, specifically in Uganda. We did some polls in Ghana, and in Ghana we are focusing basically on food security and urbanization. We did some in Senegal, which was also focusing on rapid urbanization, and then also did some in Malawi. So what I'll be presenting is basically the different case studies that we've been able to implement in the different countries in Africa. But why do we talk about this? Most times policies are top-down. When you look in most of these countries, policies are developed by parliament and then taken to the communities for implementation. But most of the policies have been facing some level of resistance in terms of implementation, but also in terms of uptake. So we tried to bring in another methodology of how we can engage citizens in terms of how they can influence policy changes, especially on controversial and complex issues like climate change. So following this, we did a 6 methods approach to engage the citizens. And in Uganda, we did this in 2 settings, one in Butaleja and another one in Bududa. These settings are affected differently. In this setting, it's more of floods, whereas in this setting, they are the landslides. But most of the policies that have been developed are cutting across. That's policies that address disaster issues. So government came up with the policies more specifically on 3 areas. One was on resettlement management, the other was on land management, and then the other policy was on population control. So in all these settings, the policies that were developed were implemented by government, but they were backfiring over time, and the government didn't have answers why most of these policies were backfiring. So we basically, if to take you into context, in this setting, we've had landslides in this area over the last 2 decades. And whenever there are landslides, there are a lot of people who are dying. So following these landslides, government introduced the resettlement management policy, which was being implemented across the country. But whenever they would take people away from these risk areas, people would return back to these risk areas and actually go to a more risky places. So government was asking, what is it that is motivating people to remain in these risky areas, even when the government has introduced resettlement policies? So government had no answers to most of these. So we also know that these disasters actually are more predictable. We know that whenever there is heavy rainfall in this context, we expect landslides and floods within the same area. But still, people were not responding to the early warning signs because somehow they didn't have the kind of policy support measures that would help these people to respond to the early warning signs. So following all this, we were able to introduce what we call deliberative polling, which I will talk more about later. But before this, is that when we asked the communities why they were resisting resettlement management, they gave all these issues. Some were political, others were kind of information asymmetries. For example, one was saying, I've been living in a mountain where I could see the village below me, but the places where government was taking them was a bit flat. So that itself was hindering them from getting into, responding to the resettlement management. The other reason they raised was the land is very fertile and grows anything. But where you're taking us, the land is quite infertile. So how do we match the two in terms of how people could be resettled? The other aspect was on ancestral attachment. In most of these countries, they do ancestral attachment that my grandfather was buried in this area. Why do you want to separate me from the ancestral burial grounds? So all these were limiting the resettlement management program. But on a political note, the politicians were saying, I'm the LC chief, the local council chief. If you relocate me, do I remain in control of the same people that I was controlling here, so that when it comes to the voting period, I'm still in charge of my people? So for all these reasons, people were not able to relocate, and therefore the relocation management was kind of a failure. So because of this, and because, of course, of this information asymmetry, because when you look at most of these areas that I've presented, they were more to do with information asymmetry between what the communities know and what the governments expect. And this is, of course, communicating to the low citizen participation in most of the discussions that involve policy formulations. So, and of course, as I also said, because most of these policies are top-down, they are developed within Parliament and then taken to the communities for implementation. So because of this, we now went out to determine whether the community opinions on key policy issues can change when they are informed more about these policies during formulation. And based on this, we implemented the 6-method approach of a deliberative polling, where we started with the first process was to do a desk review and consultations to identify the policy options. There are these different policy options that are highlighted in the policy recommendations of government. So we are able to identify those policy options, and then we randomly selected a representative sample. You saw we had over 200 randomly selected samples from the community, and of course with each of the policy options, we are able to come up with advantages and disadvantages, the pros and cons for each of the policy options, because we needed to present this to the communities to understand the both sides of this. And so after this random selection, we did a pre-survey, which we called the baseline opinion poll. So on the 200 and plus randomly selected individuals, we first did a baseline poll to understand the status of their support to the policy options that we are presenting them. Then after this, now we invited all of these people into a deliberation. So like we are gathered here, so everyone who was randomly selected was invited for a deliberation with the help of local governments. And then after this, of course, during the deliberation, we would go into plenary sessions and then break the people into smaller groups so that they can intensively discuss most of the policy options and try to come up with the pros and cons for each of the policy options. So we are also able to get the voices qualitatively, and after this deliberation, in each of the groups, they would identify the most pressing issues they would want to present during plenary. So they would identify a representative who would take the identified issues into the plenary, and within the plenary session, we would have the government representatives and the civil society representatives to respond to the issues that were raised during the smaller groups. So this would be like a question and answer to provide enough information on most of the controversial issues. So after this process, we did a post-deliberation poll to see if this participation had enabled these citizens to change on how they perceived some of these policies. And so this was the process that we were able to do, and we scientifically tested this using the scientific methods to identify policies that changed as a result of this deliberation. And key to this was we saw a lot of changes. About 36 out of 38 policy recommendations had changed after deliberations of citizens, both on the settlement management, on early warning and response, environmental measures, and local infrastructure. So we see like this was one of the representatives from one of the groups who was presenting the issues that their group had raised to the plenary session, so that they are able to get responses from policymakers, but also from people who understood, who had information about this. So these are some of the areas. For example, on resettlement management, we see that rezoning high-risk areas for no settlement was an area that was presented to these people. Before, the support was at 55%. But after their engagement, it rose to 67%. So you see the difference of 12%. And this was for Butareja, and for Bududa, actually, it changed from 77 to 84. Because now they were enhanced and engaged in terms of information. We also brought the issue of temporary stay with families during heavy rains, because those are more risky, during the risky times. This also rose to this level. But more interesting was people were more interested in having peri-urban centers for areas affected by landslides, where these centers, they could stay in the centers and then have the kind of engagements with their land during the times when it is not risky. So all these policy options were presented, and this is how they scored before and after. So we saw a lot of changes following this citizen engagement. And following this, the qualitative voices were also gathered, especially understanding why most of those were returning. So the issues that I presented earlier, all those came through the discussions we had in the qualitative groups that we had with them. And following this, now we translated these findings into policy recommendations, and we started now engaging the local governments and also the national governments on how they can implement the findings from this. So we are able now to come up with these policy recommendations, which we presented. There are some policies that can be developed at a local government level, and there are those policies that can be developed at a national level. So we are able to engage again, we are able to take these findings back to the local governments to identify which policies they can afford in terms of formulations. And then we are able also to get the policies that can be implemented at a national level. So we are now able to engage at different levels, and following these engagements, now the government has changed the policy on resettlement, and now they are instead resettling people within the areas which are accepted by the citizens. And following this process now, actually the government of Uganda has changed to resettle people in a district called Bulambuli, where now all the people that are affected by landslides will be resettled. And this was also coming from the findings that we need to be resettled in places that are quite mountainous but safe, but also the same level of fertility in those districts are quite high. In fact, the response is quite high that the government is now not ready to resettle everyone, because initially there was resistance, but as of now, people are very much willing to get to those places. And these are now some of the headlines that are coming up. Government finalizes plan to relocate Bududa landslides victims, because now after this kind of engagements with citizens, they started changing their mindset. But also they didn't know the level of citizen participation and how it can influence most of these policies in terms of adoption, but also in terms of providing safety to these citizens. So for that, I will leave this for now, and we'll get some questions on how we can have more engagements. But the key message that I can give here is that sometimes we underlook the value of citizen participation in terms of how they can influence most of these policies. And following this, we are able now to underscore how citizens could help in influencing policies. Thank you so much.